Welcome back to They All Love Jack and today's review of reviews and a curious letter confession. I am reading again out of this book. Appendix 2, a very curious letter. Within days of assuming his tenure as Home Secretary, Asquith was in receipt of a letter from W.T. Stead, now the editor of a relatively new monthly magazine, the Review of Reviews. He writes, "Dear Mr. Asquith, I have received a very curious letter from the Transvaal, which seems to me to be genuine. It purports to be the deathbed confession of a man of the name Harry Wilson, who accuses himself and either his sister or wife, Elizabeth Wilson, of introducing the arsenic into the Maybrick house in order to avenge themselves on Mrs. Maybrick. The man who made the confession died in Mashonaland, requesting with his dying breath that this letter should be sent to Sir Charles Russell. As Russell did not move in the matter, he sent it to me. I feel that this letter imposes upon me a responsibility which I would very gladly hand over to you, in case you are disposed to take the same view of it as myself. As I shall probably publish the confession in the next number of Review of Reviews, I should be very glad to hear from you, as there is no disposition on my part to do anything that would be contrary to your wishes or your judgment as to what would be fit and proper under the circumstances." Whether Asquith replied or not isn't known, at least not by me. 6 weeks later, Stead duly published Harry Wilson's confession in the October issue of his magazine. The article for which the confession was a catalyst was a brilliant supplication on behalf of Florence Maybrick. It was titled, "Ought Mrs. Maybrick be tortured to death?" And once again, the Maybrick mystery was back on the boil. Stead rehearsed what he'd already told Asquith, that he'd received a letter from the Transvaal Republic bearing the postmark of Krugersdorp, franked with 4-penny stamps and dated 19th July 1892. About 20 miles west of Johannesburg and nearly 6,000 miles from London, Krugersdorp was a small coal mining town, and of all places in the world, the last anyone would have expected to hear anything of the name Maybrick. On opening the missive, wrote Stead, which reached me August 15th or 16th, I found it was dated Rithfontein, July 10th, 1892. The extraordinary spelling, due to the effort of a South African Dutchman to spell English as he pronounces it, gave the communication an unmistakable stamp of authenticity. Okay, now here comes the letter. Mr. Stead, Dear Sir, please, will you insert this in your valuable and widely read paper, in justice to a poor woman who is still in prison for a crime another person has committed? It is about 5 months ago since I was in company with Harry Wilson from Mashonaland to the Transvaal. He was sick with fever and at last died on January 14th, 1892, So this is quite a date, this January 14th. I've been coming across this date quite a bit lately. So, I mean, obviously it's always somebody's birthday. I mean, I don't know who, but somebody's birthday. And then it was the, the crowning of Queen Margaret. And it was also the day that Elvis had his aloha moment. Okay, so let's go on. Before he died, he made the following confession, which he instructed me to send to Sir Charles Russell, barrister at law, London, England. So this must be the Bar Association. There were 4 of us who started back, and all 3 died from fever, except myself. And as nothing has been done in the matter, Sir C. Russell has not moved in the matter, I hope that you, loving justice to your fellow men, will move in the matter. He died on the Limpopo Flats on January 14th, 1892, and was buried by me. And what is the worst part, I was the only one of the 4 left to hear that miserable confession. Isn't that convenient? Trusting that you, loving justice, will take this into consideration, I will subscribe myself your most humble servant, Moreau Masina Berthrad Neuberg. So when I first read this name, the first thing that came into my mind was Sherlock's dark side, Moriarty. So that's his name apparently, but we'll get to that later. So we got the MM again. Included with the letter was Mr. Neuberg's transcribed copy of Wilson's confession. So here comes now the confession of Harry Wilson. He stated that he, in conjunction with a woman by the name of blank blank, tampered with medicine which was intended for Mr. Maybrick, put arsenic into the blank. He said because Mrs. Maybrick and he could not agree, and he had a grudge against her. There was also another woman, he called her Sarah, but I don't remember the other name. It was somewhere near Manchester, some time ago, and she is still in prison. He told me to send the statement to Sir Charles Russell, barrister at law. So I always thought these barristers are the coffee people, but okay. Stead immediately contacted Russell, who forwarded him Neuberg's earlier letter. Unfortunately, it was without an envelope and with no postmark. There was no way of establishing an indisputable date or from where it was actually posted. However, the text was headed Johannesburg and dated 25th March 1892. Once again, the Dutch is rendered into English by Stead. Sir Charles Russell. Sir, a man of the name of Henry Wilson made a confession to me in my tent at Mashonaland that he put arsenic into some medicine for the purposes of revenge on Mrs. Maybrick, near Manchester, some years ago. She was convicted of the crime of murder and sent to prison for life, and he wants me to write to you his confession of the crime. He died and was buried on the Limpopo River near the drift crossing to the Transvaal. And now here comes the official confession of Henry Wilson. He said he wanted to be revenged on Mrs. Maybrick. He, with a servant girl, tampered with the medicine for Mr. Maybrick and put arsenic into it. But how much I could not get to know, as he was delirious for 14 days. He died, and I buried him on the Limpopo Flats on the other side of the Transvaal 2 months ago. Trusting you will interest yourself on behalf of the woman Mrs. Maybrick, I remain your most humble servant, M.M. Berthrad Neuberg. This is written on arrival from Mashona land. I am sorry there's not another witness to this miserable statement. M.M.B. Neuberg. Mr. Neuberg was evidently profoundly convinced of the serious importance of the case, wrote Stead. He seems to have written to Sir Charles Russell as soon as he got within range of a post office. Except he didn't. And it's at this point that Mr. Berthrad Neuberg's correspondence begins to look decidedly iffy. In fact, this whole South African fraudulence is so transparent, I can't believe Stead gave it a moment's credibility. But believe it he did, and so did Helen Densmore. I can only imagine that their desperation over Mrs. Maybrick's plight, combined with an ignorance of the locality the letters referred to, was the reason for their unaccountable naivety. The correspondence can be attacked from whatever angle one chooses. Let us start with the geography. So now he goes on pointing out some things that just don't make sense regarding the geography. So he asked Stead to insert it in his valuable and widely read paper. How did Berthrad Neuberg know that the Revue of Revues, whose name he couldn't even spell, was widely read? The Review of Reviews was published in America, Australia, and England, but not in South Africa, and was definitely not widely read there. From whence did the semi-illiterate Dutchman acquire such insight into a foreign publication? We live in the age of the internet, but I couldn't name a single periodical in Holland, much less a widely read one whose editor was a lover of justice. Okay, so he goes on pointing out some obvious curiosities. Ernest Hemingway wrote, "All writers need a cast iron bullshit detector," or words to that effect, and I could smell bullshit. Something was staring me in the face, some kind of riddle, some hidden conundrum, but I couldn't see it. I had to step back and keep stepping back until I could. It's fortuitous that Stead printed a facsimile of the confession. I read it repeatedly before I actually started to look at it. I'll get to the text by and by, but first let us consider this document without bothering with the words. What I noticed was that Moreau Masina Berthrad Neuberg and Jack the Ripper shared the curious idiosyncrasy of spontaneously enlarging their handwriting at the end of their text. I thought I might well be looking at an element of the funny little game, and that the key to it might be hidden in the confession. For reasons best known to himself, Stead had redacted a name from its text that he'd revealed in his letter to Asquith. It was Elizabeth Wilson. Originally, the opening line of the confession read, he stated that he, in conjunction with a woman by the name of Elizabeth Wilson, tampered with medicine which was intended for Mr. Maybrick. So, skip down to here. The question, therefore, isn't who was Henry Wilson, but who was Moreau Masina Berthrad Neuberg. A dictionary of Dutch names tells us who he wasn't, or rather what he wasn't, and that was Dutch. Neither Moreau nor Masina nor Berthrad appears, and neither does Neuberg, which, if anything, is German. Yes, I can confirm. Neuberg means new mountain, like Zuckerberg or Zuckerberg means sugar mountain. What interests me about this confession is that via a surrogate, Henry Wilson, it describes precisely what I believe went down at Battlecrease House. It shares its narrative with the statement of the eavesdropping soldier Robert Reeves. Both Reeves and Wilson refer to a servant girl as co-conspirator and vehicle by which the poison could be administered. It is remotely conceivable that these two separate entities, one in prison in Brighton, England, and the other under 15 feet of water in Mashonaland, could have independently come up with the same extraordinary story. Reeves got it because he'd overheard it, and the non-existent Wilson got it from the same fucked up brain. Oh, that rhymes. Only 3 people knew how James Maybrick had been murdered: Michael Maybrick, Edwin Maybrick, and Robert Reeves. Reeves didn't write this letter from South Africa. He was in a cell in Sussex. That leaves Edwin and Michael. It was Michael Maybrick who had a grudge against Florence. She called it a spite. And only Michael knew that Florence had been framed, because it was he who framed her. Wilson's confession continues with further reference to a secret that nobody but an absolute intimate of James Maybrick could have known. Navigating the phony Dutch syntax, here it is in English. There was also another woman. He called her Sarah. But I don't remember the other name. She was Sarah Ann Robertson, James Maybrick's mistress, with whom he is reputed to have fathered 5 children. At Florence's insistence and in deference to the reputation of her deceased husband, the name was never publicly mentioned. Wilson couldn't have known it, even if he'd been real. But Mr. Moreau Masina Berthrad Neuberg certainly did. Okay, now we're switching gears, and he's talking about the Boer situation down in South Africa. The Boers, indigenous Dutch, had farmed the Transvaal in harmony with its endless horizons for almost 300 years. Gold wasn't what these simple God-fearers were about, and they tried to keep it a secret. Not because they wanted to harvest it, but because news of it would mean certain war with England. That came 15 years later, with its hooligan destruction, burning of farms, public hanging of prisoners, and recourse to Britannia's new invention of the concentration camp, where 26,000 Boer women and children were starved to death. The poet and traveler Wilfrid Scowen Blunt described it as a gangrene of colonial rowdyism, and it was everything the Boers had feared. Johannesburg at present has no politics, wrote the journalist Flora Shaw in 1892. It is much too busy with material problems. It is hideous and detestable, luxury without order. sensual enjoyment without art, riches without refinement, display without dignity. The riff-raff of the world descended upon the city, its population swelling by about 20,000 a year. Almost everyone but the Boers, the blacks, and the unlucky hit the jackpot. Johannesburg was, said one of its bourgeoning oligarchs, Monte Carlo superimposed upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Grandiose buildings went up, plush hotels, a stock exchange, and theaters to entertain the new rich. Much of Johannesburg's social life revolved around theater and music hall, and some of the biggest names in contemporary entertainment found their way to the dusty, untidy settlement. They included some of England's greatest stars, among them many of Maybrick's chums. His lifelong friend Charles Santley sang there, as did Lionel Brough and Signor Foley, both performers at the concert Maybrick had organized on behalf of the artists' volunteers in March 1889. So now he goes on looking for Eminem's whereabouts, trying to figure out where he was at the time of the letter sending. And turns out the South African press had their suspicions also about this story, because they ask, "What is this cock and bull story?" asked the South African Empire on 15th October 1892, "that Mr. Stead has received from South Africa concerning the death of Mr. Maybrick." And they go on. "One Harry Wilson, while on his way from Mashonaland to the Transvaal, falls ill with fever and dies on the road. His sole surviving traveling companion is a Mr. M.M.B. Neuberg, and before Wilson passes from this world to the next, he narrates in his agonies how, having a grudge against Mrs. Maybrick, he, with a servant girl, tampers with the medicine for Mr. Maybrick by putting arsenic into it, with the sole object of bringing Mrs. Maybrick into a murderous dock. Neuberg says, 'I am sorry there is not another witness to this miserable statement.' It certainly is regrettable, seeing that no one, unless it be Mr. Stead himself, is likely to give any credence to the so-called confession." One is tempted to ask why Neuberg, on his arrival in the Transvaal, did not make known the story to the local press. It would have put pounds in his pocket. Was Harry Wilson known to anyone in the Transvaal? Did he die with any papers about him? And where are they? These and other questions naturally suggest themselves in connection with the elucidation of the mysterious death of Mr. Maybrick. Mr. M.B. Neuberg may have taken down the statement correctly as delivered by the dying man, but who would believe the story of such a deep-dyed villain as Harry Wilson wished to make himself out to be without any confirmatory proof of his guilt? Cannot Mr. Neuberg give any reference as to his standing and respectability in South Africa? The answer to that question is no, because the whole scenario is fake. Thus, I was looking for a person, Michael Maybrick, whose pseudonym I didn't know, and another, Harry Wilson, who didn't exist. Plus, it was 6,000 miles away and 130 years ago. The effort to reduce Michael Maybrick's British whereabouts to a simple list was an endless slog. But after protracted effort, a schedule emerged. Patterns. The last known date when he was definitely in London was Wednesday, 16th March 1892, when together with Charles Sentley he sang his stuff at a concert in St. James' Hall. Another star who appeared on the Johannesburg stage, Madame Neruda, played the violin. Add to this the Ripper letter posted to the police in Marylebone 5 days later, and we get a marker at 21st March 1892. The next date was another Wednesday, 4th May 1892, when Maybrick was on the slate to attend a meeting of the Supreme Grand Chapter of Royal Archmasons. His friend and Grand Master Bro Letchworth announced that he had received a communication from Bro Michael Maybrick, Grand Organist, apologizing for his inability to be present in Grand Chapter. He never showed, and he never showed for his next engagement either. On 31st May, the Pall Mall Gazette publicized a charity concert. Oh, they love their charity concerts. To be performed in aid of St. Mary's Hospital Fund, billed for 9th June at the Haymarket Theatre. Some of the biggest names in the business had promised to donate their talents. Maybrick was among them, but again, he didn't turn up. It wasn't until a meeting of the Royal Society of Musicians on 11th July that Maybrick was unequivocally in London. There are, therefore, about 115 days between 17th of March and 10th July 1892 that are unaccounted for. He could, of course, have had his feet up in Regent's Park, or if you were as certain as I was that Mr. Neuberg was in reality Michael Maybrick, he could equally well have traveled to South Africa. Mystery, mystery. In the American edition of Review of Reviews, W.T. Stead published a codicil to his plea for Mrs. Maybrick. The case has, from the first, aroused the most intense interest, and it has created much bitter indignation against the British government for its denial of palpable justice to an American woman. A month later, indignation had found a focus, as was reported in the British edition. The United States government has telegraphed to its consul at Cape Town to take immediate steps to ascertain further particulars of the alleged confession. The Yanks were going to investigate, probably sending detectives into the Transvaal, and I think this put the wind up the British. If the Americans had found Michael in Johannesburg, the Maybrick scandal might well begin to unravel. Michael Maybrick was at the fulcrum of London society, a man who knew the men. Many of them must have known he was out of town, and not a few must have known where he was. That, I think, is what spooked them, initiating Mr. Asquith's inexplicable shutdown. Everything in South Africa that was feasible to research was researched. Every extant newspaper, magazine and microfilm. It cost endless hours without success. One last hope was the Government House, GH, archive at Cape Town, whose inventory was enormous. But, unfortunately, there is a gap in these records at just the wrong year. Everything to do with diplomatic traffic, be it British or American, for 1892 is missing. Apologists will say the file simply went missing sometime in the last 100 years. While the more cynical might say that the file was pulled. Predicated on the cheats and deceits of the British authorities during the Ripper scandal, I am of the latter school. After months of research, I was left with the impossible coincidence of Robert Reeves and Harry Wilson attributing Mrs. Maybrick's frame-up to the same servant girl. I had the secret of Sarah and a Harry Wilson alive in Doncaster. But it wasn't enough, and I couldn't prove who Neuberg actually was. By now, I had been researching Bro Michael Maybrick for rather a while, and considered myself somewhat au fait with the way he thought. He was a mason and a murderer, described by Florence as a brute. He was a smart-ass, smarter than everyone else, and was amused by the stupidity of his targets. Everything to do with his correspondence required thinking sideways, like him. He enjoyed the risky stuff. The Women of Moab, The Lady from Surrey, Yack and May-bee, to recall but a few. He was playing his funny little game, and knowing his affection for puns and conundrums, I wondered if the bastard had tried his hand at an anagram. I couldn't find Michael Maybrick in South Africa, but I still had the puzzle of Moreau Masina Berthrad Neuberg. And now he wrote down the names, and he rearranged the letters. And Moreau Masina Moriarty, that was my own little insert here. So Moreau Masina Berthrad Neuberg, rearranging the letters, and he got, I began a brute, mason, murderer, ha! So this is the story of Eminem and his anagram. And yeah, that was it for today. I wish everybody a lovely May moon tonight. And yeah, see you next time.